Have you ever wondered who the Pharisees really were through the eyes of Jesus? In a world where truths are constantly challenged, where the line between good and evil seems increasingly blurred, I invite you to dive into a journey through time, rediscovering the Pharisees under a new light. Who were they? And more importantly, what can we learn from them, not just to enhance our faith, but to live a life that truly resonates with the teachings of Christ? In this video, we will explore the legacy of the Pharisees beyond what meets the eye, delving deeply into their history, beliefs, and the moments of tension and teaching that marked their encounters with Jesus. But be warned, this is not a story for the faint of heart. It's a call to awakening, to questioning, to the challenge of looking within and asking oneself, am I living a faith of appearances or a genuine faith? Imagine yourself on a journey of rediscovery, where the pages of biblical history unfold to reveal a new understanding of figures who may have been misinterpreted for a long time. Among these figures, the Pharisees emerge, not as the often portrayed antagonists, but as central characters in a narrative rich and complex, intertwined with the very essence of faith. As we embark on this journey, we are invited to look beyond conventional interpretations, to explore the legacy of the Pharisees through a renewed and enlightened lens. This invitation is not a call for uncritical revision, but for a deeper understanding of their role in the fabric of biblical history, a role that is fundamental to understanding the religious and social dynamics of Jesus' time. The Pharisees, often depicted in a light of strict legal observance and confrontation with Christ, were also bearers of deep devotion and a sincere desire to apply God's law to everyday life. They were, in many ways, the scholars and teachers of the people, seeking to guide others in a vibrant and meaningful religious practice. In this context, we are challenged to reflect. How can the lessons of the past, even those that come from misunderstandings and conflicts, illuminate our path today? How can we, by looking at the history of the Pharisees, learn to seek a faith that is at the same time convicted and open, rigorous and compassionate? Imagine recovering a past in which the stories of biblical history are told again, only this time in ways that revolve around the centrality of characters whom we have long misunderstood. The Pharisees will be there, no longer playing the villain's part, but rather taking center stage in a story that is just as dramatic and compelling as it is faithful. When we open ourselves to this invitation, we consume a Pharisee, not through a lens of conventional interpretation, but one that has been freshly informed by scrutiny. That does not mean we celebrate revision for its own sake, but rather another way of seeing their place in the web of biblical history and their essential importance in understanding the religious and social world of Jesus. Despite a perception of the Pharisees that they live and breathe a world of heavy legal observance and are the nemesis of Christ with whom they regularly clash, it is this very group of people that also carry deep piety and an earnest attempt to live God's laws in everyday life. They were the rabbis, the teachers of Israel, trying to nurture and guide others with a living and relevant religious life. In this context, we are asked, what can the past, even our partial and painful appropriation of the past, teach us today? How might looking at the history of the Pharisees teach us to seek a faith at once strict and open, both uncompromising and unpretentious? The Pharisees are one of the most intriguing characters of biblical times, existing in a gray zone between theological and political encounters, and shaped by the interaction of faith, politics, and society in Second Temple Jerusalem, c. 520 BCE 70 CE. In this essay, we will take you to the Middle East, a place where theological intricacies are ever present, though articulated in a vocabulary readily understood by all. Consider the Pharisees as one of the three primary currents of Judaism around the time of Jesus, distinct from the Sadducees, the aristocrats and priests, and from the Essenes, who lived a monastic community across the Dead Sea. The Pharisees were mostly lay scholars and commoners. They were particularly concerned with vexing details of daily life and the appropriate application of the law of Moses that had been revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. That they had internalized the law reflects that they strove for purity and holiness among the people. They believed that the careful observance of the laws ensured these qualities, as if people participated in the holiness of God by carefully observing the commandments. One of the major identifying characteristics of the Pharisees was their respect for the oral law, next to the written law, the Torah or scriptures. According to them, the oral law was an ancient tradition of sayings and interpretations passed on from generation to generation, meant to elucidate and actualize the written law, how to apply and reapply its teachings in diverse situations throughout life. This oral law was, in a sense, a living corpus of guidance from Moses that could help the Jewish people remain true to God's commandments, spiritual integrity verified by their best conduct. In a sense, the Pharisees were the intellectual precursors of what we now call Rabbinic Judaism. Their leaders were the rabbis who presided over the communities that congregated in the synagogues, which were as much places of study and debate over the law, ethics, and theology as they were houses of prayer. Their form of religion centered on the study and interpretation of the Torah and its role in the conduct of everyday life. The Pharisees, whom we meet constantly questioning Jesus or in direct verbal confrontation with him, express major divisions at the time concerning the understanding of the law, justice, and mercy. Jesus condemned some Pharisees for their hypocrisy and for neglecting the essence of the law by making it heavy upon the people, while propounding the necessity of a pure heart as first and foremost and a religious life, which is more than the payment of external rites. In reading the New Testament narratives, we come across a number of encounters between Jesus and the Pharisees, at times tense, at other times challenging, and always suggestive of moments of opportunity in which the two groups are brought together, not so much as one fighting against the other, but as one engaging in critical examination of the other, and thus presenting a moment for teaching and understanding. Let us look at these stories one by one and see what they might say about what they expect of us in our own dealings with God. Imagine that you are walking through a Judean city whose lanes are dusted by foot traffic. Jesus is already there, when he's not tending to the sick, sharing meals with the poor, or preaching the gospel of God's kingdom. He is making his way from place to place. His steps will often converge with those of the Pharisees, who are men of faith, servants of God, and defenders of the law. They are suspicious of Jesus. In their presence, he will answer puzzling questions and fend off determined challenges. The two groups will cross paths continuously, and each encounter will raise fundamental questions about the human heart and the heart of God. In one of those occasions, the Pharisees ask Jesus why his disciples don't fast as we and the disciples of John do. Jesus will answer, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them?" Mark 2:19. Here, Jesus won't simply explain himself. He will also invite us into a new vision of the kingdom of God as a time of feasting and communion, not of mourning and fasting. Another time we see Jesus heal a man on the Sabbath, boldly defying the Pharisees' understanding of what was allowed on this particular holy day, in a way that just about unravels their whole theology. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, says Jesus, Mark 2:27. The Jesus story simply will not allow the law to be the thing, and love and compassion to merely follow it. Every encounter, every discussion invites us to ask, how do we make sense of the laws we are bound to respect? Have they brought us together with God and with each other, or have we made them into fences that separate and inhibit? Jesus deals with the Pharisees in a way that points us to a faith that goes beyond a merely outward adherence to rules, always seeking to understand what is the deepest truth, the fullest love. The character of the Pharisees is similarly more nuanced in these stories, so that it is possible to see some of them, like Nicodemus, coming to Jesus with genuine openness to learn about what he is teaching. Such a multifaceted approach offers an important caution against seeing all the others in a negative or monolithic light. Within each faith, there is a journey of discovery, which is individual and unique. We too, as modern readers of these accounts, are invited not simply to be spectators at the drama unfolding as these particular encounters unravel, but fellow seekers, seeking the truth and love that Jesus shares with us as his very own follower. How can we apply these encounters to the challenges and confrontations of our own day-to-day lives so that we can become more like him, compassionate, questioning, patient, faithful? The Pharisees seem to inhabit an intriguing role at the interstices between the biblical narratives of faith, politics, and society that take place in Second Temple Jerusalem. If you're interested in them, perhaps a context that mixes baked goods with a metaphysical theology, one that boasts both complexity and is broadly accessible, is for you. Think of the Pharisees as one of the major rabbinic streams of Judaism of that period, which arose in juxtaposition to the Sadducees, the aristocrats and priests of Jerusalem, and in confrontation with the sect of the Essenes, who withdrew to the desert and led a monastic life in isolation. Contrary to the first and the last, the Pharisees were largely scholars and laymen, and they were passionately concerned with the problem of how to apply the law of Moses to life in society, believing that careful obedience to the laws was not only a way of honoring God, but also preserved the people in their purity and holiness. According to rabbinic sources, the Pharisees also revered the oral law as a second Torah, complementing and not contradicting the written law, Torah in the usual sense of scriptures. In addition to the scriptures, a tradition of teachings and oral interpretation, safeguarded in an unbroken chain of transmission from generation to generation, explained and elaborated the written law as a living body of practical guidance for all areas of life. This tradition was the oral law, a living word, Mishneh, of God, capable of guiding the faithful in the fulfillment of his commandments. The Pharisees were a kind of intellectual foreshadowing of rabbinic Judaism. As we know it today, the rabbis who brought the congregations together in the very synagogues that they'd invented for the purpose of not just prayer, but also study and argument about the law, ethics, and theology. Their brand of Judaism stressed the necessity of engagement with the law, the interpretation of the Torah, its application to daily life. This thread is one of the most radical and difficult passages in the tapestry of the Scriptures. And if the encounters between Jesus and the Pharisees are not just a clash between two worldviews, not just a dispute about how one should live, experience, and express faith and obedience to God, but a mirror in which we should recognize ourselves, then what? What do these critiques say to us, looking back at our own life and faith, our practice, and our particularities? How can Jesus' warnings shed light on our lives, helping us to see how the pitfalls he identified in the Pharisees are still snares for us today? Have you ever been writing a check to the denominational leadership and noticed that you were paying as much, if not more, attention to the from line was the to line? Jesus was critical of the Pharisees for paying more attention to the appearance of piety than to justice, mercy, and deeper faith. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint, rue, and herbs of all kinds, and neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. Luke 11:42. How do we guard against allowing our own pilgrimage of faith to look more like a string of froms and pay less and less attention to what matters on the to line? And how about pride? The Pharisees loved to be seen by men and to be honored by men, Matthew 23:5, for their performance of religious duties. We might ask ourselves when our own desire for recognition stopped us being truly diligent to hear and know God's approval. Then Jesus has words too for empty legalism, which straps on Siamese twin burdens to their fellows. They tie up heavy, burdensome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them, Matthew 23:4. Of all the days when we should have learned this lesson in our lives, how can we make sure that it's the one we take from you into that grave? These critiques, however, are not calls to despair, but to reformation. We are called to a faith that is alive, works for justice, practices mercy, and walks humbly with God. How do we begin to make this call real in our lives? How do we grow from outward faith into inward practice? How do we move from a faith made up of rituals and rules to one that arises from a genuine commitment to the ethics of the kingdom of God? May Jesus' criticisms of the Pharisees encourage us to look at our hearts and our lives, to study them together, and consider if we are taking God, ourselves, one another, and the world less seriously than we should. May we be spurred not only to avoid the mistakes of the Pharisees, but to aspire anew to be faithful in relationships with a God that makes a difference and calls for fuller human living. And so, the promise as well as the challenge is to experience ways of renewal through examining and responding to these questions. For instance, biblical characters such as Jesus employ their encounters with the hypocritical Pharisees and their parables to frame how we ought to lead our lives. Or rather, to frame how we should approach the simple yet glaring errors that the Pharisees commit in virtue of their snide posturing and consequent burning desire to be revered and rewarded by their community. In order to appreciate how each and every human being can become a surrogate Pharisee by continuously trying to earn loyalty from God and from their fellow human beings, let's examine some of the stories of Jesus that not only elucidate his critique of Pharisaic hypocrisy, but also teach the valuable lesson of the humility and authenticity of faith. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18:10-14 is arguably the most powerful parable that Jesus ever shared to deliver these points. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and said, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And Jesus concludes that the tax collector, not the Pharisee, had gone home justified before God. God values the contrite heart that recognizes that it needs mercy far more than he values the public display of piety he sees performed by the Pharisee. A second defining event reveals Jesus' concern for the motives of religious behavior. In Mark 7, Jesus reverses the mirror, reproaching the Pharisees and teachers of the law for prioritizing the traditions of humanity over the commandments of God. And he said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, yet their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me.'" Here, Jesus focuses on hypocrisy, concerned that a pious tradition-based behavior, on the surface, substitutes for love, which is the essence of what is genuinely valuable before God. The practical example of Jesus in this regard comes perhaps most blatantly at the Last Supper, when he washes his disciples' feet, the task appointed explicitly for servants. If we wanted to understand Jesus' preaching about humility, we would do well to put the fact of Jesus' own emptying of himself, as seen in his washing of the disciples' feet, first. Indeed, the text from John 13:1-17 makes it quite clear that this act, an act of humbling oneself for the service of others, holds not just a particular example for certain people, but is in fact the definitive statement of what greatness consists of in the kingdom of God. It is not rank or estate, and it is not observance of the law, it is attitude, humble servant love of others, and not self-centeredness. Their tale is challenge yes. Where are you exaggerating in your devotion to God? Are you focusing on the right things? Is your heart towards him? Do you want to walk in ways pleasing to him out of modesty and love? Or are you putting on a liturgical carnival and forgetting it's for him? And may our admiration for Jesus' denunciations of the Pharisees and for his manifestos on the humility of the heart and the nature of true faith lead us to long for a greater spirituality, for a God who is alive in our own hearts and who is also alive in the hearts of our neighbors, a God in whom our love for others' well-being is never desired at the expense of our dependence on God. May we foster again that fragile and holy calling to be a beloved child of God. To try, in short, to remember the Pharisees with the respect we accord to our own, people for whom, for all our differences, to live according to their best understanding of God's will, was the ultimate and most beautiful achievement of all. The Pharisees devoted themselves to daily observance of Jewish law in a time of great political unrest and social change. They were zealots of their faith, practitioners of prayer, fasting, and charity, robust in their calling to the study and teaching of the Torah, and synagogues were their hubs of worship and learning and community. The first forms of Jewish identity were forged later on, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, what eventually became Rabbinic Judaism, another heirloom we continue to nurture in our existence. Imagine walking alongside Jesus, following his steps through the dusty roads of Galilee, the bustling streets of Jerusalem, and even to the garden where he prayed, to the cross where he gave his life, and finally, to the radiant dawn of the resurrection. With each step of this journey, Jesus teaches us about love, humility, and service, eternal values that should guide our lives and our communities. Now, imagine how these steps can resonate in your own life. How can we, in our day-to-day, reflect the unconditional love that Jesus demonstrated? How can we cultivate the humility he embodied, serving others without expecting anything in return? How can we strengthen our faith community to be a genuinely welcoming place, where everyone, regardless of their story or current situation, can find love, support, and opportunities to grow? Let reflection on the Pharisees and the teachings of Jesus inspire us to seek a faith that is authentic, alive, and active in the world. And as we live out this faith, may we be beacons of hope, channels of peace, and builders of communities where the love of Christ is lived and shared openly.